This is what the PlayStation was gonna look like. But all that changed on one fateful day in June 1991, when Nintendo backstabbed Sony. Sony's revenge didn't just create the PlayStation, it split the entire gaming industry in two and rebuilt it into something Nintendo never saw coming. This is that story. To understand how badly this blew up, you need to understand how big Nintendo actually was in 1991.
Nintendo has been the hottest, best-selling toy for 3 years running and has cornered over 90% of the video game market.
They weren't just a mildly successful video game company. Nintendo had an 83% market share of the home console industry in North America at its peak.
29 million American homes, that's nearly 1 in 3, already have Nintendo.
The remaining 17% was mostly Sega and a few people still holding on to their Atari out of stubbornness or loyalty. Nintendo didn't compete with other companies, they were the industry. But here's the thing about monopolies, they get comfortable. And comfortable companies make decisions that look smart until they don't. In Nintendo's case, that decision was cartridges. Cartridges were fast and reliable, but they were also getting outrageously expensive to manufacture. Nobody at Nintendo was asking if something better existed, but someone at Sony was. Before Sony was a gaming company, there was one man at Sony who had no business being involved in gaming at all, and he spent years refusing to accept that. Ken Kutaragi. This guy's the reason why every millennial loses their mind when they hear this. In 1983, Kutaragi bought his daughter a Famicom. As he watched her play on it, he didn't notice the graphics or the gameplay. He noticed that the sound was awful. For a Sony audio engineer, this was physically uncomfortable. So he then did what any loving father would do. He offered to build Nintendo a better sound chip without telling Sony about it. Sony's executives found out about this, and naturally they were furious. The only reason he kept his job was because Sony CEO Norio Oga personally stepped in and essentially said he's too good, let him finish it. The chip Kutaragi built was the SPC 700. It went into the Super Nintendo and became one of the most beloved pieces of audio hardware in gaming history. It's thanks to him that Super Mario World sounds so good. That whole experience made him realize something. Nintendo was the peak of gaming only because nobody had tried to go higher yet. That's when he got the idea to build a CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo. The project had been quietly in development since 1988. By 91, it had a name. The Nintendo PlayStation. 2 words with a space in between. This signaled that nobody had fully sorted out who owned what. Because buried in the fine print of their contract was a clause that changed everything. Sony's version of the contract gave them control over the Super Disc format, meaning they'd control licensing, approval, and revenue from every CD-based game sold on the platform. Not just their hardware, the format itself. If you wanted to make a game for the CD add-on, you'd go through Sony, not Nintendo. Now Nintendo, a company that had spent a decade controlling every cartridge that went into one of their consoles, had agreed to hand that control to someone else. The moment they actually read the fine print carefully, they realized what they'd signed. Which brings us neatly back to June 1991. But before we continue, a quick reminder, if you love all things nostalgified, remember to subscribe for more videos like this. Now back to the video. So, on the 1st, Sony took the stage at the Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago and announced the partnership. A CD-based Super Nintendo, co-developed with Nintendo. The crowd was super excited because CD-ROM technology was everywhere in 1991. 24 hours later, Nintendo took the stage. But instead of talking about their partnership with Sony, they announced a deal with Philips, a Dutch electronics company that most people in that room probably last thought about when they bought a toaster. Nintendo had organized the Philips deal in secret and timed the announcement to happen at the exact event where Sony had just publicly celebrated their partnership. Now, Nintendo wasn't wrong to be nervous about Sony. Kutaragi had been openly using the partnership as a first step towards getting Sony into gaming full-time. Nintendo's president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, saw exactly what was happening. If Sony controlled the disc format, they'd eventually control the whole ecosystem. Nintendo would become a games company making games for a Sony-controlled machine. So, Yamauchi ended it. Fast, quietly, and without warning. But the Philips deal he switched to was not a great outcome for Philips. They made some games that are now remembered mainly as collector's items and cautionary tales, and exited gaming entirely not long after. But that wasn't the point. The point was to escape the Sony contract. Most companies would have retreated. Sony's gaming division barely existed, and after the incident at the Consumer Electronics Show, a lot of people inside Sony wanted to walk away entirely, focus on TVs, Walkmans, electronics, leave Nintendo and Sega to a market Sony didn't really understand. Kutaragi's response was to threaten to quit, because of course it was. He told Sony's leadership, "Build the console or I'm gone." Seriously, the amount of power this guy held over his bosses is aspirational. Olga, the same CEO who'd saved Kutaragi's job over the SNES sound chip, made the call again. Sony Computer Entertainment was officially formed and Kutaragi was put in charge. And instead of an add-on that needed Nintendo's permission, they'd build a full console, one that didn't need Nintendo at all. And here's what Sony understood that Nintendo didn't. Developers hated cartridges. Not publicly though, you didn't say that out loud to Nintendo if you wanted to keep making games. But privately, they were all talking about how the economics sucked. A SNES cartridge cost $10 to $15 per unit to manufacture. A CD cost under $1. On a million copy game, that's the difference between $10 million in manufacturing costs and less than $1 million. Sony wanted to make things as easy as possible for their developers. Cheaper dev kits, friendlier licensing. Essentially, they said, "Come make games here, we won't make it painful." Word spread fast, and the company that moved quickest was about to deliver one of the most devastating blows Nintendo ever absorbed. Now, I'm sure you guys are familiar with a little game called Final Fantasy. While the makers of Final Fantasy, Square, had been a near second-party Nintendo developer for years. When it came time to build Final Fantasy VII in full 3D, they prototyped on the Nintendo 64. Then they saw the storage numbers. Final Fantasy VII shipped on 3 CDs, so it would have been functionally impossible on a cartridge. Square moved entirely to PlayStation, and Nintendo, like a jilted lover, reportedly told them to never come back. By 1995, PlayStation had been on sale in Japan for 6 months with strong numbers. Now it was time for North America, at E3, the biggest gaming event of the year. Sony showed the games, showed the hardware, then they announced the price.
I'm going to ask Sony Computer Entertainment President of America, Steve Reyes, to join me for a brief presentation. $299.
Right before that, Sega had already announced their console, the Saturn, at $399. Nintendo, meanwhile, was still 2 years from launching the N64 in North America, still committed to cartridges, watching Sony build market share in a space they'd owned for a decade. When the N64 finally launched in 1996, cartridges cost $50 to $70. PlayStation games started at $40. PlayStation sold 102 million units worldwide. Nintendo 64 only sold 33 million. That was a sign that the entire industry was restructuring. But here's the thing though, Nintendo didn't become a bad company. They became a different kind of company. The N64 gave the world Super Mario 64, which basically invented 3D platforming as a genre. Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time still appears on Wikipedia's greatest games ever made list today. And in North America, Ocarina actually outsold Final Fantasy VII, on the console that got crushed in the overall market. So the irony was that Nintendo made extraordinary games on the hardware everyone agreed was the less friendly choice. But what Sony actually changed wasn't specs or price, it was who gaming was for. Nintendo's ecosystem was controlled and curated. The kinds of games that got made, the kinds of experiences that existed, all managed tightly. That's part of why Nintendo's games are so consistently excellent. The trade-off is that things that couldn't pass Nintendo's filters simply didn't get made. Sony opened the door to messier, darker, stranger games. Resident Evil, Metal Gear Solid, Silent Hill, Crash Bandicoot, Tomb Raider. These weren't essentially better than Nintendo's games, they were different, aimed at an older, broader audience Nintendo hadn't fully been serving. The age range of the average gamer expanded, and the kinds of stories games could tell expanded. That wouldn't have happened if the Sony-Nintendo deal went differently and Kutaragi accepted rejection and moved on. So the PlayStation was born from a betrayal, built by someone who probably should have been fired twice, and launched by a company who 2 years earlier had no gaming division. By the way, the Nintendo PlayStation prototype actually exists. One survived and was rediscovered in 2015. It went to auction for $360,000, which is a little bit more than
$299.
In the end, Sony didn't beat Nintendo because they were better engineers or had better games. At first, nobody was even sure they had any good games. They won because Nintendo handed them the reason to try. So what do you guys think? Who makes better consoles, Nintendo or Sony? Fight each other in the comments.
Fight!
A partnership that lasted one day had 30 years of consequences. And the rivalry hasn't ended. They're still at it today. This was only the beginning. But there was one company Sony had to finish off first. If Nintendo and Sony were the millennials and Gen Zs of gaming companies, then Sega was Gen X, desperate and irrelevant. However, they did give Sony a run for their money. Find out how they almost beat Sony in the home console market up next in part 2 of Console Wars.